Hello everyone, welcome to Dream Loom, where we listen, we relax, and we drift into sleep. Thank you so much for joining tonight. We'll begin a gentle retelling of the classic story of Beauty and the Beast. It's a perfect cozy tale for an autumn evening, guiding you softly toward rest. Let's take a quiet moment to settle in and release any tension lingering in your body or mind. Make yourself comfortable, and as you ease into stillness, let your breathing stretch just a little longer, especially on the exhale. Focus your attention gently on each breath, letting the calm, steady rhythm of the air moving in and out become a soothing, mindful experience. When I speak to you here before each story, I try to say the things I know I would want to hear if I were slowly drifting off to sleep to this show. Falling asleep has always been a challenge for me, particularly at certain times in my life. Even now, some nights are still difficult, but over time, I've learned to stay calm and not let the struggle create more stress. It's true, restless nights can make the next day harder, but worrying about sleep only keeps us awake longer. So, as you listen tonight, remember, you can use your breath to ease tension, release stress, and calm your mind. It's a simple yet effective way to guide your body into a gentle, restful state. This is especially helpful when paired with a dreamy story like this one. A tale as old as time, one that carries warmth, wonder, and a touch of magic. Without further ado, let's drift together into the fairy tale world of Beauty and the Beast. Once there was a merchant named Laurent who had staked all his fortune on a fleet of ships, only to lose them entirely at sea. He was a widower, so he didn't have to share this news with a wife, but he had 6 children, all accustomed to a life of comfort and ease. When word spread that the family was nearly ruined, the children struggled to accept the change. As days turned into weeks and the ships never returned, Laurent began selling fine furniture, the family carriage, even his daughter's jewelry, and their expensive dresses. They had to leave their richly appointed home and move to a small cottage on the edge of town. Laurent often traveled, visiting business contacts and seeking partners who might help him rebuild. While he was away, the children, 3 boys and 3 girls, were left to care for the house themselves. Although they were nearly adults, the 3 boys and 2 eldest girls were unskilled in practical matters. They had grown used to a life of study and idleness. The youngest daughter, Camille, was different. She was willing to take on the necessary chores and responsibilities. Perhaps it was her youth, or perhaps her kind and steady nature, but she tried her best to learn how to run a home. The family wasn't well liked in the village, and the older children made no effort to adjust. They didn't try to prove themselves capable, nor did they attempt to make friends with the neighbors who might have helped. Camille, however, sought advice from the villagers about unfamiliar tasks: baking, sewing, gardening, and caring for chickens. Gradually, their suspicion turned into genuine affection as they admired her willingness to learn and her determination to work hard. Over time, Camille became the heart of Laurent's household, the one holding everything together. While her older siblings struggled with the loss of comfort, Camille ensured their home stayed tidy and that there was always something on the table. One day, nearly 2 years later, word arrived that one of Laurent's lost ships had finally returned, the cargo mostly intact. The family rejoiced. The older siblings declared that their long, hard years among the villagers were over. Camille felt happiness at their relief, but the news didn't touch her as deeply. She had grown to love their modest cottage, its neat garden, and the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. Though she was glad to see her family happy, she wasn't sure she wanted to return to their old life of idleness. She had become someone who liked being useful. To reclaim his property, Laurent had to travel by horse to the port, a journey of a few days. Once there, he could arrange the proper distribution of his recovered wealth and hire a coach to bring his family back in comfort. In anticipation of their restored fortunes, he asked each child what gift they would like him to bring from the city. The older siblings demanded luxuries, silk shoes with sparkling buckles, elaborate hats, velvet capes, furs, and jewels. Camille, however, remained silent, thinking carefully about her request. When her father asked her to speak, she hesitated before answering. "Father," she said gently, "I have always dreamed of seeing a rose. They don't grow in this part of the country, and they are so rare and beautiful. If you could bring me a single rose, any color, it would make me very happy." Her father chuckled at the simplicity of her wish, but agreed warmly. Privately, he thought he might also bring her a small trinket to accompany the flower. The morning of his departure was fine and clear. Camille carefully packed his saddlebag with provisions for the journey and bade him farewell with a tearful but brave smile. The older siblings were less concerned. They were used to their father's travels and only thought of the gifts he would bring back. As Laurent rode away along the sun-dappled forest path, Camille stayed at the cottage, watching until he disappeared from view. She felt a faint sense of unease, though she didn't want to follow him. After all, their fortunes had clearly taken a turn for the better. While the children waited, Laurent steadily made his way toward the port city, filled with anticipation at the thought of reclaiming his wealth and status. Though he had suffered great losses, this returned ship could be the start of a new venture, perhaps even the beginning of a new fleet. His mind swirled with dreams of spices, silks, and other goods he might bring home to enrich their lives once more. It was crushing for him to arrive, only to find his hopes shattered. It was true. The ship had returned with most of its cargo intact. Yet news of his good luck had spread fast, and his many creditors had acted quickly. By the time Laurent tried to reclaim his belongings, they had already been handed over to settle his debts. He contacted one merchant after another, asking for more time to pay his large bills, but nothing worked. By the end of the day, he was a man free of debt, yet he had nothing in his hands. There was no money left to invest, and certainly none to buy the gifts he had promised his family. He felt so hopeless that he didn't even want to stay in the city overnight, without first preparing himself, thinking about the weather or sending any messages ahead. Laurent mounted his weary horse again and rode out, retracing the provincial road that had brought him to the port earlier that morning. A few hours outside the city, night fell and a violent storm began. Lightning flashed, thunder boomed, and the wind howled, tearing branches from the trees. Laurent's horse panicked and bolted off the main road, carrying him into a forest he didn't recognize. Realizing too late how reckless it was to travel at night, Laurent searched desperately for shelter from the wind, perhaps a cave or some kind of refuge. He didn't know how long his horse wandered through the roaring gale. Finally, he saw a tall stone wall rising before him. He urged his horse forward, hoping it marked a house where he could find protection. Reaching the imposing wall, he realized it was not a house but the boundary of a large estate. A high iron gate stood slightly ajar. With no time to worry about manners, Laurent dismounted and pushed the heavy gate wider, leading his horse inside. Slowly they moved along a paved path that disappeared into the darkness ahead. Leaves swirled violently around him, and rain pelted down, making it hard for Laurent to see the large building looming in the gloom. It was a mansion, certainly. Though the storm limited his view, he could make out a grand entrance and multiple large rooms with tall windows. It was an intimidating place for an unexpected visitor, yet he had no choice. He feared he would not survive the night without shelter. Securing his horse in a small alcove, he walked to the massive front door and lifted the iron knocker. It fell with a hollow sound that echoed through the storm, almost in answer to the thunder. When no one responded, he took a deep breath and pushed the door inward with all his strength. It gave way, and he nearly fell onto the cold stone floor of a grand entry hall. Laurent lay there for a moment, catching his breath in the eerie stillness. Through the crack in the door, he could still hear the rain lashing the steps, and he felt relieved that at least his horse had shelter. Rising slowly, he saw that he stood in an opulent reception hall with twin curved staircases on either side. Suits of armor stood as silent guards, and ahead, richly carved double doors hinted at the rest of the house. The silence inside was deep, almost absolute. A soft light glowed through the cracks of the doors in front of him. After trying briefly to call out without success, Laurent took another deep breath and stepped toward the illuminated room, pushing the doors open slowly. He entered and scanned the space. A fire roared in the enormous hearth, and a table was set for one, with simple dishes, a carafe, and a large glass arranged neatly. His eyes wandered over the rest of the cozy room. There were upholstered chairs and small tables stacked haphazardly with books. Yet there was no sign of the house's owner. Awkwardly, Laurent sat in one of the armchairs and waited a few moments. His eyes kept drifting to the meal laid out on the table. The loaf of bread and the scent of roasted meat tormented him, and his stomach growled loudly. As minutes passed and no one appeared, he gave in to his hunger. He took a slice of bread at first, then slowly ate the entire meal. He spent an hour in contented quiet, imagining that the owner might be elsewhere, also hiding from the storm. Drinking deeply from the glass, he finished the rest of the dinner. He told himself that the house's owner was away and that he could explain himself in the morning. After finishing the food, Laurent leaned back in his chair, drinking the remainder of the carafe. The fire crackled and popped, casting a comforting warmth. He then took the letter about his recovered cargo ship from his pocket. Only a short while ago, he had been filled with hope, and now those dreams had vanished again. He dropped the letter on the table without thinking and sank into a deep, dreamless sleep. He slept through the night, and when he awoke in the morning, it took a moment to remember where he was. The fire had burned down, and the plates and glasses from the previous night remained on the table. It seemed his host had not returned. Feeling embarrassed for entering someone's house without permission, Laurent decided not to wait. He planned to leave quietly, reasoning that the meal would have gone to waste anyway. Rising from the armchair, he walked across the room and pushed the double doors open. Weak light filtered into the entryway, revealing the austere hallway more clearly than the night before. Stepping cautiously into the foyer, he tiptoed past the watchful suits of armor as if they might spring to life. He glanced at the twin staircases and noted that the carpet runners were neglected and messy, as if no one had lived here for some time. He stepped lightly over the flagstones toward the massive front door. Grasping the handles, he pulled with all his strength, and it slowly creaked open, revealing a mist-filled courtyard beyond. Squeezing himself through the narrow opening and then pushing it shut behind him, he straightened his waistcoat and tried to reclaim some dignity. Leaving his imposing refuge like a thief in the night felt odd, but he resolved to put the humiliating journey behind him. Moving quickly, he returned to the alcove where he had tied his horse the night before, relieved to find her safe. He reached into the saddlebag to offer her an apple left over from the supplies Camille had packed for him. After untying the horse, he led her quietly down the stone path he had traveled in the whipping wind the previous night. Glancing back, he noticed the mansion rising darkly as daylight grew. It was a huge chateau, long, beige, and rectangular, with a central main section flanked by identical wings on each side. Tall, narrow windows lined the two main floors in a precise, regimented pattern, giving the impression that the building was staring down at him. The sloped tiled roof bristled with chimneys, adding to the imposing atmosphere. Turning away from the sight of the grand house, he guided the horse toward the front gate, taking note of the untended gardens along the walkway. Nearing the end, he spotted a particularly charming pergola overrun with rose bushes. In the center of a circular seating area, one rose bush bore the most breathtaking pink blooms he had ever seen. Suddenly, he remembered the promise he had made to Camille, and determined to honor it, began cutting the roses with a knife he kept in his bag. One rose would not be enough to make up for his sudden reappearance. He would take them all. So focused was he on his task that he did not notice someone approaching. As he stepped back from the now bare rose bush, he felt eyes on him. A tall, fierce-looking man glowered down, or at least Laurent thought it was a man. The figure resembled a human, but his face was hidden beneath a wild tangle of hair, and his body was unusually tall and muscular. He looked completely unprepared for visitors, dressed in a crumpled linen shirt and breeches, as though he had stormed over in a hurry. Furious, he growled, "What do you think you are doing?" Laurent froze, painfully aware of the bouquet in his left hand. He stammered an explanation, claiming he thought nobody lived there and assumed the roses would not be missed. Seeing the man's expression remain unchanged, he added that he had promised some to his daughter. The beastly man stood silently for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Then, drawing himself up to his full height, he said, "You took advantage of my hospitality without asking. You ate my food, slept in my chair. I overlooked all that. But now you have stripped every bloom from my most treasured rose bush. Each flower holds great value to me, and none can replace it. You must make amends for this." Laurent's heart sank. Shaking his head, he told the man he had nothing to offer, no way to pay. The man regarded him coolly. "Then you will work off your debt. I am in need of laborers here on my estate." Laurent's mind raced. "Sir, I have 6 children at home. I cannot stay. What will become of them?" The man remained unmoved. "Either you work to repay your debt, or someone from your family must take your place," he said. "Take your roses. They are no use to me now. Return home, make your arrangements, and I expect you or your replacement here within a week. If you fail to appear, I will find you." With that, the fierce man turned and strode toward the chateau, never looking back. Laurent watched him disappear inside, realizing he had no choice but to return home and explain everything to his children. He did not yet know how he would manage their care in his absence, but he hoped the man's temper might soften and his service would not be required for too long. As the storm cleared and daylight strengthened, Laurent was able to retrace his path to the main road and continue homeward. He rode steadily, though slowly, pondering the news he would have to share. The day was beautiful. The mist had lifted, and the early autumn sun bathed everything in warm light. Birds sang cheerfully, as if nothing had gone wrong, yet his heart felt heavy with dread. He arrived home late that evening, greeted by the eager faces of his children, who expected gifts. They rummaged through his saddlebags, looking for the promised treats. With regret, he offered each child a single rose. Camille took hers delicately, inhaling its scent and admiring its perfect bloom, but the other 5 demanded to see the real presents. That night, around the crowded kitchen table, Laurent recounted the events of his ill-fated journey to the port city, describing the loss of his remaining fortune and the circumstances leading to his current obligation to the mysterious chateau owner. When he concluded that he would have to return and work off the debt, his 5 oldest children were displeased, pouting and worrying how they would manage in his absence. Camille remained silent, sitting quietly, lost in thought. Finally, she called for calm. Her siblings looked at her in surprise, for Camille rarely voiced her opinions. She declared that she would go to the chateau to take her father's place. Laurent's eyes filled with tears. He protested vehemently, insisting she could not. Yet Camille's reasoning was sound. Her father's presence was needed at home to support the family, but she could be spared. Skilled in household tasks, she could handle whatever work was required, and there was no other reasonable solution. She would go. It took a day or 2 for Camille to prepare her modest belongings for the journey. As the rose her father had brought her began to wilt, she pressed it carefully into a book to preserve it, a reminder of why she was leaving home and the promise that bound her to the mysterious estate. To work for this strange master on a remote and lonely estate, Camille felt anxious about leaving behind everything she had ever known. But she was determined to make her father proud. The morning of Camille's journey arrived bright and clear. She and Laurent packed her belongings into a small cart that they hitched to their loyal horse. The chateau would take 2 days to reach by foot with the horse pulling the cart. Laurent knew of an inn along the way where they could spend the night. Family members gathered outside the cottage to see them off. Among them was a mix of relief and quiet admiration. They were glad that they would not be left to face the world alone for very long. The first day of the journey was calm and uneventful. The good weather lasted throughout, and their night at the inn passed without incident. However, the second day brought gusty, gloomy weather. As autumn began to make itself known in the forest, the first fallen brown leaves swirled across their path, and the wind hissed through the branches. Their steadfast horse plodded along, slowly bringing them closer to the estate. When Laurent saw the turn leading away from the main road toward the chateau, his heart sank even further, sensing his father's gloom. Camille summoned her courage and smiled at him encouragingly. "Don't worry, father," she said gently. "I am capable and will manage." He nodded, hoping her words were true eventually. They reached the dark entrance of the estate. Laurent knew the moment had arrived. He pushed the gate open and guided the horse forward toward the looming mansion for a second time. Camille stared in awe at the sight before her. The elaborate, overgrown gardens and towering, unforgiving walls of the house were grander than anything she had ever imagined, overwhelming yet beautiful in their strictness as a village girl. Camille was speechless at the sheer size of the place and felt its deep mystery and permanence. The very stones seemed to be asleep, waiting silently to be discovered. She wondered what kind of work she would have to do and hoped it would not be beyond her abilities as the former keeper of a small cottage. Laurent stopped the horse at the wide front steps, the wind gusting sharply as if to push them back slowly. Camille climbed the steps, lifted the heavy door knocker and let it fall. Father and daughter stood waiting, expecting a fierce figure to appear to their surprise. The door opened slowly and a boy appeared. He seemed about 13 and wore simple peasant clothing peeking out. He studied them with direct curiosity. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded. "Is one of you the new servant?" he asked. Laurent was briefly taken aback, but explained that he had come to deliver his daughter Camille, who would serve to settle a debt. The boy nodded, unsurprised, and tugged on the door, motioning for her to step inside. Then he told Laurent he could leave Camille's belongings in the grand foyer and go. The boy slipped inside, presumably to announce the new servant was present with the wind at her back. Camille walked through the doorway, stepping into a new life. The parting with Laurent was emotional, but they both tried to appear brave. The loyal horse turned toward home, under the weight of gloomy skies, not looking back until they were past the chateau gates. The swaying forest trees then closed behind them. Camille stood uncertainly in the echoing hall. The gray light of the overcast day filtered through tall windows above the door, but offered no warmth. She shivered, edging toward the trunk that held her belongings, telling herself she must summon courage and do her best. After a few minutes, the boy returned and announced that the Baron had instructed him to take her to her room. He cheerfully lifted her trunk and began carrying it up the large curving staircase. Camille followed, surprised to be going up instead of down to a kitchen or servant quarters. She wondered if she would be staying in the attic, to her astonishment. The boy turned down a grand hallway. They walked along the richly carpeted east wing, past staring portraits of nobles from long ago, as if they were permanent residents. And this new girl, an unexpected visitor. Camille was so absorbed by the painting she almost ran into the boy when he finally stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. Camille followed him inside and discovered the most finely furnished bedroom she had ever seen. It was not overly large, and the furnishings were modest yet elegant. The canopied bed, fine fabrics, and polished wood trim felt luxurious as she looked around, noting a window seat and small dressing table. The boy started a fire in the hearth once it was crackling. He stood, dusted off his hands, and smiled at her. "I'm Gabriel," He said, "I help the Baron with chores and such. I'm glad you're here. It can get lonely sometimes, and I could use some company." Camille wasn't sure how to respond. She wondered what exactly the daily work would entail instead. She thanked him for lighting the fire and asked when she would meet her new master. Gabriel said the Baron would see her tomorrow to explain her duties. For now he would bring a simple supper, and hoped she rested well then. As suddenly as he appeared, Gabriel left, quietly closing the door behind him. Camille collected herself and began unpacking. She hung her clothes in the large wardrobe, carefully placed her few books on the side table by the bed, opening the top volume. She smiled wistfully at the pink ribbons marking pages. She closed it and set it aside. Walking to the window, she tucked into the soft pillows of the seat. From there she could see the courtyard and gardens growing wild along the edges of the paths, and climbing the stone walls of the chateau. Twilight approached, and the wind tossed leaves and debris across the paved yard, forming small, swirling cyclones. Dark clouds raced across the sky. The rising moon, weary from the journey and the strangeness of this new life, briefly dozed in the cocoon of the curtains. She was stirred by a knock at her door. Pushing herself away from the window seat, she slowed her breathing and opened the door. Outside, a tray held a simple dinner: bread, cheese, soup, and some hot tea. Looking up and down the hall, she saw no one. Gabriel was light on his feet, that much was certain. Carrying the tray into her room, she set it on a small table by the fire. She was starving and ate every last bite. Barely bothering to prepare for bed, she pulled back the coverlet and slipped into the warm embrace of her sheets and pillow. In less than a minute, she was asleep. That night, Camille dreamed oddly. She found herself walking the dark hallways of the chateau, following a large dog. The animal disappeared into different rooms, only to reappear a few moments later in the hallway. Each time, she hurried to keep up. She reached a doorway where the dog had vanished most recently. Peering into the room, she saw not a dog, but the back of a man sitting at a desk. He began to turn in his chair, but just as he was about to face her, she woke, sitting upright in bed. The fire had dwindled and sunlight poured through her window. As her waking confusion faded, there was a knock at her door. Gabriel stood there with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Mayle," he said politely. "I've brought you some breakfast." He gestured toward the hallway. "The Baron requests that you meet him in his study when you've finished." Camille nodded, took the tray, and he disappeared again. An hour later, Camille stood nervously outside the very room where her father had once eaten his stolen fireside dinners. She heard paper shuffling inside. Clearing her throat, she knocked lightly. The noise ceased, and a chair scraped across the floor. Momentarily, a man with an abundance of facial hair appeared. His features were sharply prominent, and his face seemed to carry a permanent scowl. He was alarming, yet Camille controlled her reaction. The man bowed his head politely in greeting. Camille inclined hers in return. He peered at her appraisingly and nodded his ungainly head. Then he motioned for her to sit in a chair by the fire. He sank into the armchair opposite her. "I see that you are the one to work off your father's debt. Are you familiar with basic household duties such as cleaning and cooking?" Camille nodded. The man appeared satisfied. He lifted a heavy ring of keys from a nearby table. "As you can see, I am very short on help. Gabriel tends to my basic needs. His mother ensures we have bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he runs errands to town. But beyond him, I have no one to manage the estate. I'm sure you can tell just by looking around. It is still a lot of work, but just you and Gabriel will manage. We will make do." He paused, as if awaiting a response. Camille felt overwhelmed at the thought of being the sole housekeeper in this enormous mansion, but she said nothing. The man continued, "These keys will open most rooms, though many may never need to be used. If there's something Gabriel cannot provide, speak to me. Otherwise, I am not strict and would like you to make as many household decisions as you can on your own. I spend most of my time in my study or the library." Overcome by the enormity of the task before her, Camille could only nod, signaling that the meeting was over. The man stood abruptly. Camille rose, accepted the ancient-looking keys, and nodded. As she made her way out, he called after her, "Dinner is at 7. It would be sensible if you joined me in the dining room." She bobbed her head, thanked him, and left. Standing bewildered in the echoing front hall, she felt both lost and hemmed in by the space. She spread the heavy keys across her open palm and studied them. She did not know what doors they opened, but they carried a quiet aura of authority. Her thoughts were interrupted by Gabriel emerging from the shadows. Grinning at her, he asked if she would like a tour. She accepted gratefully, marking the start of her adventure as the housekeeper of the chateau. Camille soon learned that the Baron lived alone and had done so for many years. Because of his fierce appearance, locals feared him, whispered cruel stories, and treated him roughly in public. Gabriel was the only one who connected him to the outside world. He had begun running errands for the Baron years ago, but soon grew to understand and appreciate the man beneath the stern exterior. He insisted the Baron's bark was worse than his bite. Gabriel spent his days attending to necessities at the house and returned at night to his family's modest home on the edge of town. "Truly, miss," he said, "the Baron is a fair and kind-hearted man." Gabriel guided Camille through the chateau's many rooms and corridors, revealing its decay and neglect. Most of the rooms along the gloomy halls were unused. Camille's keys opened bedroom after bedroom, many covered with dusty sheets, fireplaces cold, and furniture stacked in disuse. Some rooms had not been entered for decades, even centuries. Cobwebs draped over belongings, and sunlight barely penetrated the grime-covered windows. Only a few rooms were used daily, and Camille was expected to clean and organize them, including the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the front entryway. The most marvelous room was the library. Gabriel allowed Camille a peek while the Baron was elsewhere, and she was astounded. The vast space had high ceilings trimmed in gold, with bookcases lining every wall except where windows broke the pattern. Rolling ladders perched at either side, ready to slide along the shelves. Countless volumes in shades of crimson, forest green, navy, and brown beckoned to be read. Camille, an avid reader despite having possessed only a few books during her father's financial troubles, had never imagined a collection like this. According to Gabriel, the Baron spent much of his time here, surrounded by books, a sanctuary within the vast, lonely chateau. And it truly seemed to be the case that throughout this opulent hideaway tables were stacked with volumes that were open to particular pages or grouped together in clusters. Two well-worn leather armchairs suggested long hours spent turning heavy pages. Gabriel told her seriously that he was always to keep the fire burning in the great room during the day. Camille pictured what it might be like to open one of these countless books and sink into a soft chair, inhaling the smell of the aged ink-stained paper. It was intoxicating. Camille understood that the only way to make progress in this neglected house was simply to choose a spot and begin that first day. She and Gabriel dusted and organized the front hall and cleaned the kitchen. Gabriel and the Baron had been preparing simple meals there for years, but much of the space clearly needed attention. Camille was no expert in cooking, yet she took satisfaction in making the kitchen gleam. Once more, she sent Gabriel to town with a list of supplies to be delivered. Then, standing in the grand, silent kitchen, she began to work. Unused counters were cleared of dust pots and pans, received a much-needed polish, and the cold, empty space slowly started to feel alive again by the time it was time to sit down for dinner with the Baron. She had made a simple roasted chicken meal. It was modest, but she felt proud of it with little time to tidy herself. Camille returned to her room. Gabrielle had rekindled the fire there, and she used her washstand and mirror to freshen up, putting on her nicest dress as she walked to the window to draw the drapes for the night. She paused and looked out into the dim courtyard, which lay silent as if weighed down. Nothing moved, not even a single bird. It was as though the grounds were under a spell of quiet. She carefully gathered the velvet curtains and stepped back from the window. There was so much to discover in this place, she thought. Then, lighting a candle, she moved through the dusky corridor and slowly descended the wide stairs, the tall doors of the dining room. The space was very grand for two people at once. It must have hosted sparkling parties and elaborate dinners. Camille looked up at the crystal chandelier, which glittered above like a canopy of stars. Gabriel had set 2 places at one end of the long table, and the dinner was ready. She was the first to arrive and did not wait long. The Baron's large frame appeared awkwardly in the doorway. He paused and gave a brief nod in greeting. Then he gestured toward the 2 settings, indicating she should sit. Camille gladly took one of the cushioned chairs. "I can see you've been busy with Gabriel today," the Baron remarked, raising his eyebrows at the hearty meal she had prepared. "He has carried a heavy load these past years. As my only help, I am glad you will be here to share some of his work." Camille nodded, unsure of what to say when she is my lord, and paused when he shook his head. "Please, you may simply call me Antoine." He replied, "I am lord of nothing now, lord of this chateau and its pile of dusty relics." He joked darkly, then, meeting her gaze, he added, "I am sorry you were compelled to come here under such circumstances, but I hope you will find it comfortable. I try to be fair, and I am pleased for your company." Camille nodded and smiled faintly. "Would you like me to tidy the library tomorrow?" she asked. "I wasn't sure if you wished me to enter there." The Baron considered briefly and nodded that it would be fine. Then he added, "You should feel free to borrow any book you like from the room. After all, in Descartes' words, the reading of all good books is like conversing with the greatest minds of past centuries. I think you will find that my library has an almost magical capacity to provide any book you have ever heard of." Surprised by his courteous offer and cultured words, Camille studied her peculiar-looking employer while he ate. She had been at the chateau only a day, and already her perspective was shifting. She was mistress of a vast house with full freedom to work as she wished, and she had been offered access to a grand library. Perhaps this twist of fate was not as grim as she had imagined. She studied her plate quietly by the flickering fire, hearing only the clinking of silverware on china. The Baron and Camille did not converse much that evening, finishing their meal in respectful silence later, resting comfortably beneath the crisp white sheets of her canopied bed. Camille felt hopeful this remote estate might hold many secrets. She looked forward to uncovering them, in time turning onto her side. She gazed sleepily at the drapes, closed tightly against the night outside the window. Inside the chateau, a flame burned, keeping the place warm. She could feel it the next day. After tidying the kitchen, Camille cautiously approached the library. She knew the Baron was in his study, and it seemed a good time to explore the marvelous room of books, while ostensibly cleaning, taking a duster. She moved carefully among the stacks and tables, attending to surfaces covered with years of dust. As she was about to shift a few stacked volumes, Antoine appeared in the doorway. "Please don't disturb any stacks or open books," he said. Camille apologized and stepped back from the pile she had been touching. "No need to apologize," he reassured her. "I understand it may look disorderly, but I am researching and don't want to lose my place." Then he asked if she had picked a book for herself. She said she had not and asked for suggestions. Camille admitted she felt unworthy of tackling such important works. She had a much simpler background than he. Antoine smiled and spread his hands. Awareness of ignorance is the first step to wisdom, seeing her perplexed look. He winked humorously and added that bit of advice comes from Socrates striding across the room. He selected a small volume from a lower shelf and handed it carefully to her. Perhaps you would like some of his other ideas. He thought strongly, but we should all question things. Camille accepted the book with a nod of thanks. I'm ready to leave the room before she did. However, she turned back and asked if she might hire villagers to tidy the gardens before winter. Antoine looked at her somewhat sadly and shrugged. If Gabriel can find anyone willing to venture onto the estate, you are welcome to do so. Unfortunately, most people were too afraid to enter the halls of the chateau. Rumors and strange tales had circulated about me over the years, which left me mostly alone. Camille frowned. How can you endure it? Doesn't it make you angry to be treated so unfairly? Lebrun looked down, thoughtful, and answered, I was once a more handsome man, but also vain and foolish. It took a serious misfortune for me to see my mistakes and understand the disdain people held for me. Perhaps it is just the price I must pay for my past folly. Camille stayed silent. She wouldn't press any more questions that day, but she was determined to uncover how her employer had come to such an unfortunate state. For now, she looked forward to spending the evening reading Socrates in her room after dinner. Camille adapted quickly to her new life as the housekeeper of the chateau and gradually came to love it. Through careful persuasion, she convinced Gabriel to hire a few men from the village. They came one day and cleared the gardens, which had suffered years of neglect. Camille gave strict instructions that the rose bush by the pergola must not be harmed. It had been planted by Antoine's mother and was evidently very dear to him. She nearly regretted inviting the village men when she overheard them speaking ill of Antoine. He's an absolute monster, one said loudly to the others. He lives like an animal, another added. No manners, unfit for human company, but I'll take his money, the man finished bluntly. Camille noticed Antoine standing by the window, quietly listening to the whole exchange. She hurried to close it, anxious to spare him the sting of their cruelty. He waved her off, apparently unbothered. I'm used to such talk, he said. It has been many years since I could mingle in society. Still, Camille felt upset. How can you tolerate such unfairness? People who don't even know you, how can you not despise them? She asked. He shrugged, his eyes drifting to a stack of books on a nearby table. A great English playwright, William Shakespeare, once wrote not to make a furnace for your enemy so hot that it scorches yourself. By keeping goodwill for those unknowing people, I lighten my own burden. He smiled and nodded at Camille. You might enjoy reading Shakespeare yourself. He wrote some excellent plays. Then he turned back to his books, leaving Camille to ponder his words in the gray, drizzly day outside. Despite the many chores awaiting her each day, Camille still made time to explore the house. As autumn settled in with crisp mornings, early sunsets, and chilly nights, she wandered the corridors with a candle, using her heavy ring of keys to unlock and examine the countless closed doors. Most were bedrooms, remnants of a time when the chateau hosted noble guests. Dusty sheets covered elegant four-poster beds, expensive furniture, and velvet chairs. One day, she discovered a particularly special room. It was clearly a lady's chamber, unlike the others, and still contained many personal belongings. A delicate dressing table gleamed in the sunlight, covered in jars of powder and perfume bottles. Elaborate wigs, typical of decades past, rested nearby, as if waiting to be worn to a grand ball. Opening the wardrobe, Camille was astonished to find a row of exquisite silk dresses, styled in the fashion of the time before the Revolution. She ran her fingers lightly over the fragile fabrics, almost afraid they would crumble. She imagined the elegant woman who had once worn them. Inside a chest of drawers were glittering necklaces, and a small velvet box contained a sapphire ring that sparkled brilliantly. Camille closed it quietly, not wanting to appear as if she were stealing. Regretfully, she slipped out and locked the room again. It was like stepping into a window of happier times, the most beautiful sight she had seen in the entire house. Camille wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel delivered when he ran errands. She reassured him that she was treated kindly and enjoyed her work. After her first month, she even began sending him some money. The Baron told her that she must be paid for her work, as her efforts had restored the damaged rosebush. He hoped she would remain and promised her a weekly salary. Camille gladly accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, Camille felt she had found her calling. Her organizational skills were put to excellent use, and the access to his vast library became one of her chief joys. It was easy to forget that Antoine was considered unattractive. Nothing had changed in him except that Camille made sure his clothes were tidy and presentable. Occasionally she would see him reflected in a mirror and for a brief moment perceive a handsome man with harmonious features. Then, blinking a few times, she would refocus and see the same imposing, fearsome man as before, perhaps a trick of the chateau's dark magic on her mind. Sometimes a beggar would knock at the door during biting winter winds. In the village, beggars were often rebuffed and denied aid. Camille expected Antoine to send them away, but instead he would instruct her to give them coins. Moved, she asked why he showed such charity, as none of the villagers had ever shown him kindness. He referred to Aristotle, a philosopher he admired. It is the trait of a magnanimous man to ask no favors but to be ready to do kindness for others. Then, a bit sadly, he added, I must learn to be more magnanimous, for my past life led me to ruin. She could get no further explanation at that time, but she longed to understand exactly what had caused Antoine's solitude. One evening, they sat together in the candlelit dining room, enjoying a hearty winter stew. It was then that Camille gathered courage to ask how he had come to live so alone in the chateau. Antoine hesitated, sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair, then took a long sip of his drink. Slowly, he began to tell his story, starting many years ago. I lived here with my mother. My father had passed away when I was a young man, and that's how I became the lord of this place. I loved my mother dearly. She was beautiful, both inside and out, always cheerful and lively, yet kind to everyone. It was her rosebush that your father had stripped of its blooms. Antoine paused for a moment, uneasy, then went on. When my mother fell ill and passed away, I was left entirely on my own, and I'm ashamed to admit that I did not live well. I was inexperienced and foolish. I wasted the family wealth on extravagant possessions and pointless parties, neglected the estate, let bills pile up, and failed to care for my staff properly. Without my mother's guidance, I fell into a poor way of life and became of no value to anyone, including myself. One night, my servant told me there was a woman at the door, begging for food and money. I was in the middle of a lavish party and didn't want to be bothered. I told him to suggest she find work elsewhere. Antoine's memory made him wince, clearly hurt by his own words. But before the servant could turn her away, she pushed through the crack in the door and said I was cursed by my own foolish pride. She claimed that I would live unloved and unfulfilled, and that the key to my freedom could only be found in humanity. Camille leaned closer, curious. Humanity? What could she have meant? Antoine shrugged. That's the riddle I've wrestled with for decades. My library seems endless, filled with the writings of wise philosophers, mathematicians, and poets. The best minds of humanity are at my fingertips, probably part of my strange enchantment. My mind grows sharper, but still, all the wisdom I study hasn't freed me from this fate. Camille watched him across the table, hearing the soft crackle of the fire, imagining him sitting alone by countless fires for years without anyone to talk to. How long had he been trapped in this solitary prison, turning pages in his library, seeking redemption? Antoine tried to break the silence with a bright smile. Ah, well, he said. The great Isaac Newton said that finding the simplest truth takes years of thought. Perhaps one day, I will find the answer. Lying curled up on her bed that night, Camille felt she finally understood. All these years, Antoine had spent his time studying, thinking, reflecting, and repenting. He was no longer the man who would refuse kindness to even the undeserving. She wondered if he would always remain here, surrounded by books and relics of the person he once was. She hoped not, because she had come to admire him. She tucked the covers around her chin and watched the dying glow of the fire, surrounded by the quiet of the house, and slept another night. Throughout the deep freeze of winter, Camille and Antoine lived in pleasant companionship, with Gabriel as their loyal link to the outside world. Many rooms of the vast mansion remained locked and unused, but the areas they needed were neat and warm thanks to Camille's care. Meals were simple, but filling. Outside, the courtyard filled with thick, blinding snow, and sometimes the cold wind whistled through the empty corridors. Inside, the trio stayed close to the fireplaces, buried in their books. Eventually, signs of spring arrived, and Camille received a letter from her father. Her eldest sister had secured a marriage match, and her wedding would take place in a few weeks. He asked if the Baron would allow her to take some time off to attend the celebration. Antoine put down his book and looked at her with a gentle, sad smile. "Of course she must go," he said. "Take all the time you need." Camille thanked him, noticing again that she no longer saw a beast, but a man. She blinked several times, dispelling the illusion. As she left, she paused, glanced back at him over her shoulder, then went on, leaving him to his reading. Her journey to her sister's wedding was uneventful. Family greeted her with curiosity and some newfound respect. They admired her tasteful new clothes, purchased with her earnings. It was clear that the money she sent home had helped secure her sister's marriage. Though the match was humble, her family was no longer seen as impoverished by the villagers. They were stable and respectable, thanks to Camille's steady income. Yet, despite being inside her family home, she felt less at home than before. Though confined to the chateau all this time, her worldview had expanded and her horizons had grown. Sitting around the fire with siblings who focused only on petty concerns, she felt stifled. She regretted leaving her father again, but felt relief when he parted from her at the gates of Antoine's estate. She was ready to return to her role as mistress of the house. Her happiness turned to dismay when she saw the state of the house. Gabriel eagerly answered the door, clearly delighted she had returned. "Nothing has been the same since you left," he whispered. "The Baron is disheveled and hasn't left his library." Camille put away her things and went straight to see Antoine. Opening the library door, she found her room in chaos. Books strewn everywhere, open and stacked in disorder, empty glasses lining the tables. Antoine slouched in a chair, looking as if he hadn't changed his shirt in days. At the sound of her arrival, he looked up with a sheepish but relieved expression. For a moment, Camille saw him as a regular man, and it took her a moment to reconcile her vision with reality. He was unkempt and rather beastly, yet still the man she had come to care for. Within a few days, Camille restored order. Dust and neglect from a couple of weeks were easily handled, and Antoine's mood lifted with her return. Gabriel confided in her quietly, relieved that things were back to normal. However, to go away again, he said the Baron had immediately sunk into a deep and terrible melancholy and had become almost completely useless in managing anything, even remembering to eat his meals. With spring bursting all over the estate, it was impossible to stay sad for long. Camille felt very glad she had taken the trouble to have the garden cleared before the winter. The courtyard looked absolutely beautiful, and the lovely plantings designed many years ago by Antoine's mother once again shone to their best effect. Flowers of every color delicately presented themselves, and the birds seemed to increase their numbers each day, singing sweetly in the morning and inviting the residents of the chateau to the garden. Camille and Antoine began spending afternoons reading outside in the pergola. Antoine often released Gabriel from his tasks early so that he could enjoy time with friends. Camille also took great pleasure in opening the windows of the stuffy mansion, letting fresh air flow throughout the estate. Life started to feel new and lively, as if the entire place had turned a corner. As summer approached, Camille received another message from her father. It seemed that her other sister was about to be married again, and Camille was invited to the event. She felt torn. She felt obligated to be with her family for the wedding, but she couldn't imagine leaving Antoine once more. Faced with this dilemma, she came up with an unusual plan. She suggested to Antoine that he accompany her to the wedding and take a room at an inn nearby. Antoine was shocked at the idea. "Have you seen how people react to me?" he asked. Camille had expected this. She reminded herself that her own village was far away, and that the villagers would not have formed opinions about him based on rumors. Privately, Camille no longer saw him as terrible. She saw the wise and kind man she had come to know. Surely the people at home would give him a fair chance. The fact that a lord was attending a village wedding did not even seem strange to her anymore. She had long stopped thinking of Antoine as either beast or baron. He resisted at first, refusing to go. Camille insisted she would not attend without him. Faced with her determination and the prospect of missing her sister's wedding, Antoine finally agreed, though he seemed reluctant and gloomy. As the planning continued, Camille sent Gabriel to the town tailor to have a new, well-fitted suit made for Antoine. She had noticed all this time that he wore outdated, frivolous styles from decades ago. The new fashion was simpler and more elegant, giving him a dignified appearance rather than that of a relic. Finally, the day arrived. Gabriel wished them well on their journey. He had never seen the Baron leave the estate. He promised to keep everything from falling apart until their return. The journey to Camille's village was swift by carriage, taking just a day. It was a fine day, summer showing itself with lush greenery. The horses trotted along the forest road as sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting warm beams on the path ahead. At first, Antoine was silent, seemingly resisting the idea of traveling in public with Camille. After a few miles, however, he joined in conversation about a book Camille had been reading, and soon they were enjoying their usual lively exchange. Camille smiled, seeing the best in him come forward, and felt as if she was sitting next to a charming companion. She did not try to disrupt the magic of the moment. Inevitably, their journey came to an end as twilight fell, and crickets began their nightly serenade. Antoine and Camille arrived at her family's cottage and stopped the carriage. By the time they had climbed down, the entire family was at the door. All four of her remaining unmarried siblings stared rudely at them. Laurent made a greater effort to remain polite. He stepped forward, nodded at Antoine, and thanked him for bringing Camille and for honoring them with his presence. But Camille felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment when her brother whispered something to her older sister, causing her to laugh. It was obvious they were making fun of the Baron. Everyone felt relief when Antoine left for his lodgings. Camille was ushered inside, where she spent the evening talking with Laurent and her siblings, politely asking about the wedding preparations. She worried about how Antoine was doing at the inn and hoped he was being treated well. That night, as her head rested on the pillow, she drifted to sleep with thoughts of him weighing heavily on her mind. She realized she would be glad when the wedding was over and they returned to the chateau, which now felt like her true home. When Antoine arrived at the church the next day, Camille's fears were confirmed. They sat in silence during the ceremony, both feeling as though every eye in the congregation was on them. The small church felt cramped, with everyone scrutinizing them. The celebration afterward took place on the village green. The party was simple but festive, with punch, cakes, and wildflowers creating a cheerful atmosphere. Ladies gathered in small groups, delicately enjoying sweets, while children played freely across the lawn. Camille and Antoine, however, did not feel part of the celebration. She stayed at his side, stiffly nodding to villagers who had once been so kind to her. Those who had talked to her about gardening or baking now whispered behind their hands and nodded knowingly in their direction. Not a single neighbor spoke kindly to Antoine, though he smiled politely and said nothing. Her family ignored the pair entirely. As they stood, hoping the party would end, Camille overheard two men nearby. "He may have money," one said with a smirk, "but no one will ever agree to marry him with a face like that." The other man laughed. "Sad state of affairs when you must court your own maid," he added. These words were the last straw for Camille. She set down her punch and moved to the center of the gathering, announcing that she had something to say and demanding everyone listen. "I convinced the Baron to come with me because I thought you were good people," she said. "I believed that his fine character and kindness would be clear to all of you, that he was not the beast people had made him out to be. I am ashamed to admit I was wrong. None of you deserved his attention, and we will trouble you no longer. Let me tell you this, Antoine is a better man than anyone here. I would choose him as a companion over every single one of you, 100 times over, and that is the truth." The room fell completely silent. People looked from Camille to Antoine and back again in utter confusion. As Camille turned to face him, she saw the most remarkable thing. Where the beast had stood, a handsome, dignified man now smiled gratefully at her. No matter how many times she tried to clear her mind or adjust her view, his face did not change. The thick facial hair, the overly prominent features, and the massive proportions were gone. He was as beautiful as any man she had ever known, and that did not shift. Whether it was a change in perspective or the final working of an enchantment, the others at the gathering acted as if nothing unusual had happened. They greeted Antoine warmly and smiled at Camille, as if the strange and embarrassing episode had never occurred. The villagers behaved as though they had never seen a beast among them. It was baffling and wonderful all at once. A veil had been lifted forever, and in this quiet moment of triumph, Antoine was finally freed from his enchantment. For so many years, he had sought answers in his library, studying the wisdom of humanity. But he had misunderstood the woman who had cursed him. Those lonely decades of learning to be kinder, more generous, and more forgiving had cultivated in him the humanity that ultimately won Camille's heart. That was the missing piece that released him from his curse. Not long after, Camille and Antoine sat together under the pergola in his garden, admiring the rosebush his mother had once nurtured, now blooming more beautifully than ever. Twilight descended gently over the chateau, and crickets emerged to serenade the world as the happy pair enjoyed the warm summer evening. Camille gazed at this new Antoine, appreciating the handsome face that had been hidden for so long beneath the beast's disguise. As she watched, he straightened up and reached into his pocket, drawing out the very ring she had secretly admired in his mother's dresser. "You were the only one who took the time to see me as I truly am," he said softly. Then, in his gentle, thoughtful way, he quoted one of his favorite books. As Copernicus said, "In the middle of everything is the sun. You have become that sun." Winking at her, he added, "After all, I think you have shown that you are more than qualified to manage this chateau." Camille laughed, nodding in agreement, and allowed him to slip the sparkling blue gem onto her finger. She gazed at it in wonder, recalling the first time she had seen it in the mysterious bedroom among the fine dresses and other jewels. It had winked at her in the sunlight, almost as if it held a secret just for her. Now she would be part of the history of this house. Before the summer ended, Antoine and Camille exchanged vows in the chateau courtyard, surrounded by the heavenly scent of blooming roses and the sweet songs of birds from the treetops. As they stood beneath the shadow of the house, Camille looked at Antoine with a grateful heart. She felt a deep sense of belonging in a place that had once seemed so foreign. This was no longer the same lonely, desolate place she had arrived at a year ago. Through kindness, patience, and the pursuit of wisdom, she and Antoine had found joy together. The days passed in blissful harmony. Camille found comfort in the rhythm of the estate, walking among the gardens, hearing the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, and the laughter of Antoine echoing through the halls. Their life together was peaceful and full of small, perfect moments. The quiet early mornings by the fountains, the warm golden afternoons tending the roses, and the cool evenings under the star-filled sky. Antoine's study had once been a place of solitude, filled with books and unanswered questions, but now it was a sanctuary they shared. Camille would sit beside him, listening to his thoughtful reflections on the world, and he, in turn, would smile at her insights, realizing how deeply she understood not just the estate, but him as well. The chateau itself seemed to respond to their happiness. The walls felt lighter, the gardens brighter, and even the old stone paths appeared to glow in the sunlight. What had once been a home of shadows and quiet regrets became a place alive with laughter, love, and the subtle magic of a life well lived. Evenings were their favorite. They would walk slowly through the garden, hand in hand, speaking in soft tones about everything and nothing. The scent of roses and the gentle song of crickets were constant companions. Antoine would recount stories of the chateau's past, of his mother's careful planning of the gardens, and Camille would listen with wide-eyed fascination. Every word, every detail seemed to strengthen the bond between them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a warm golden glow over the estate, Antoine paused to look at Camille. "You have changed everything," he said quietly. "I never knew such peace could exist." She smiled, squeezing his hand, knowing that they had created this happiness together, that their love had made the impossible real. Their days were full of simple joys, reading in the sunlit library, preparing meals in the kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and herbs, and watching the seasons turn over the sprawling estate. Camille discovered joy in small things, from the flutter of a bird's wings to the way sunlight danced through the leaves. Antoine's laughter became the music of her days, and in turn her presence brought a lightness to his life he had never known was possible. The villagers too began to notice the change. They came to visit, greeted by the warmth of a chateau now filled with love and generosity. Antoine was no longer a distant, mysterious figure. He was a beloved part of their lives, respected and admired, not for power or wealth, but for the kindness and wisdom he now radiated. Camille's presence softened him even further, and together they became a beacon of hope and happiness in the community. Years passed, and the chateau flourished under their care. The gardens bloomed more brilliantly than ever, reflecting the joy and love that filled every corner. Children played along the paths, villagers shared stories under the old oaks, and the air was always scented with flowers and laughter. Camille and Antoine, now partners in every sense, moved through life with a quiet confidence, grateful for the trials that had brought them together and the love that had transformed them both. In the quiet moments, as they sat together watching the sunset behind the hills, Camille often thought of the journey that had brought them here. She remembered the loneliness, the fear, and the mystery, and marveled at how far they had come. Antoine, once a solitary figure burdened by a curse, was now a man full of life, laughter, and love, and she had been part of his transformation. Their story was no longer one of sorrow or enchantment, but of discovery, kindness, and the enduring power of the human heart. And so, under the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative steps together, Camille and Antoine lived in harmony and happiness. The chateau, the gardens, and the village all thrived around them, a living testament to patience, understanding, and love. Every day brought new joys, small miracles, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had created a life filled with meaning and beauty. The years rolled on gently, and their love only deepened. Antoine and Camille continued to grow, learning from one another and sharing every triumph and every simple, quiet moment. They had faced the impossible, endured the lonely decades, and emerged not only unscathed but stronger, wiser, and infinitely happier. The chateau, once a place of mystery and sadness, had become a home filled with warmth, laughter, and everlasting love. And in this peaceful life, under the blooming roses and the endless sky, they found the truest magic of all, a life lived together, fully, gently, and beautifully.